What They Don't Tell You brings you real conversations about wealth management that real people have behind closed doors. We bring together clients and experts to talk about topics that go beyond the numbers. In this episode, we share the complex reality of business successions. Business advisor Gregg Becker offers advice in how to navigate those family conflicts, awkward conversations, and even fistfights to help make your transition successful.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Robert Bradburn. I'm the AVP of Wealth Advisory Services with CWB Wealth Management. I'm joined today by Gregg Becker. Gregg is the owner of Predictable Futures. He has numerous years experience working with small to mid-sized organizations, both family-owned and otherwise, with experience in executive programs from Wharton and MIT. He also has an MBA from somewhere else.
Western.
Gregg, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, I've worked for 20 years in small and medium enterprises, leading companies, and got very used to the dynamics of family businesses and private companies and the transitions that happen with ownership and leadership. So that's where the interest came from.
So, Gregg, it seems to me in our conversations in the past that a lot of what you do is working as communication specialist, a lot of psychology that's involved, ahead of time before a business transaction takes place. Would that be right to say?
Yeah, I mean, I'm clearly not a psychologist. That's certainly not my strength or my credentials, but we are working on the relational and I'll call them the upstream emotional issues that have to be decided before a transaction. Because a lot of times there are issues that even the owners themselves aren't aware of until they get into it. But if you wait until you're into the midst of the transaction, they can often stall the process or slow it down and cost you a lot more money or have suboptimal outcomes. So we work on getting those things straight, and that way the transaction can flow more quickly and be more of value.
So, Gregg, I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about the three-circle model.
Sure. So, first of all, I shouldn't get credit for this. This was developed in the Harvard in the 1970s, but it's used globally. Like I've literally run into it in Europe and other places as well, Asia. And what it basically says is that there are three dynamics in any family business succession. The first is the family dynamic. The second is the business dynamic. And the third is an ownership. Most owners experience all three at once. They're in the eye of the hurricane, and it all seems like they're in the center of that. But if you think about a simple thing like a husband and wife working together in a business and they get a divorce, the divorce happens in the family dynamic. It is a family phenomena, but it absolutely will affect things in the business. If they're both working in the business, how does that work? It could also affect the ownership dynamic. So what we always say is you have to think about how the family impacts the business impacts the family, and of course, especially in transition and succession, we have to think about what about ownership? How does the family affect ownership, or how does the business affect ownership? Can we have people who are family members who own shares if they don't work in the business? Can they be family members that are owners without working in the business? But what about if they get out of the business? Can they still have shares? Can they still work in the business? So there's all these questions. And most families haven't thought through all of those kinds of things. And they bump into it. And it's like, So having the three circles helps them separate those conversations and think about what makes the most sense for our family. What makes the most sense for our business? What's the best way to structure our ownership? And it shifts over time. As families grow, you can just imagine, now all of a sudden we've got, what was a mom and dad now has, 3 kids, or they've got with grandkids. And some of them are working in the business and they want to get into ownership. Well, how does that work? So what was a simple conversation between a husband and wife around business issues on a Saturday night years ago now is much more complex.
Right. So every part of the organization and the family and the ownership revolves around those three circles. And what happens in one could very easily impact what's happening in the other.
Yeah, all does, all day long.
So you're coming in as an outsider. You have to earn their trust. I imagine lots of times in family situations, there's a lack of trust and communication amongst the members of that family. So how do you do that? How do you create conversation, communication, and build trust up within a family that sometimes isn't always working?
Yeah. There's an old saying that says something like, they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And we really do care. I mean, after 25 years of working and caring for a family business and caring about the families and caring about the businesses, they can pretty much hear your heart right away. And once they hear your heart, they will trust you enough to get them started. And that's usually what we need. The other things we'll do is we'll have individual interviews first. So they can just tell us personally, without having to talk to each other about these issues, what they are feeling about this, what they want to accomplish, what they think the obstacles are, what the dream is, what the goals are. Once they've kind of got that figured out individually, it's easier to have a joint conversation. And of course, we design our process in a way that builds, starting with a communication layer, then building trust, then moving forward into the more contentious or tense issues. So we actually guide them through and create a safe harbor all the way through so that they can get to that stuff, but not on the first day because they're not ready.
Right. So your experience, of course, is going to be vast in a broad range of different industries and business types. So you must have experience with a number of different clients. Tell me, do you have any examples of when you were able to really break through to maybe like a tough egg or somebody that you didn't think was ever going to come around to having those types of conversations?
Yeah, well, we worked with everything from retail and forestry to manufacturing and, of course, oil and gas and everything in between, services, insurance. There was an insurance company where we had a founder. It was actually he and his brother running a very successful brokerage business. And a son of one of the brothers working in the business. The son was totally frustrated because he'd been promised for years he was going to get to move up in leadership, take over the company, not only from a leadership perspective, but also from an ownership perspective. And in the meantime, they're all navigating the family picture. But the son had given up hope. He basically said, this is never going to happen. They talk about it, but it just never happens. Very common refrain for that next gen coming up. The parents were absolutely committed to it. But the problem was they didn't think he was ready. Mm-hmm. And in truth, the parents themselves weren't ready. So we had to help them figure out what it meant to be ready, what it meant for him to be ready, and to get commitment levels from both of the two brothers that this could happen. They gave the son enough trust to hang in there while they navigated through and worked through the transition issue.
So you had mentioned, we talked a little bit about these affirmation rounds.
Oh, yeah.
So tell me what an affirmation round is and how does it help?
Yeah, when a family started getting going, especially if there's low trust, if there's been a lot of conflict, they've been through a tough time. One of the things you got to do is you almost have to get them to the point where they actually believe in each other enough to make it to want to do this. So we'll have the family in a room. And by the way, you have to understand there are spouses here. These are not necessarily all the people who are working in the business. They could be other people too, but they're affected because they're in the family. And we actually literally go one by one, and we'll take a person and we'll have everyone else kind of just speak one thing that they really appreciate about the other, about the one being talked about, being affirmed. And we'll go right around the table. We capture all of that so they can look at it later and think how great they are. That can be a little bit terrifying if you don't trust the other people, because you might think they're going to say hard things about you or veil, in a nice way, they'll veil a dig or something like that. Or if you're just not used to that, so of a certain generation, that can be a tough thing. But, often those are the people who hear things that they've never heard before that they do need to hear about their family caring about them, for the pride that they have in people in the family, for the way they brighten each other's day that they don't even know that they do, things that they've done in the past that have been wonderful that are remembered. And that helps remember, oh yeah, that's why we're family. That's why we want to work together. That's why we actually care about each other enough to go through this well.
So with that in mind, then it sounds like a lot of what you do goes beyond looking at an individual transaction or thinking about a deal that's coming up, really trying to understand the individuals behind the organization, how they work together, what might be creating roadblocks for the success of that organization.
A lot of it is the communication. And it might sound like it takes time, but you know what? One of the consistent bits of feedback that we get from clients is that we actually speed the process up. Because if they get stuck for 6 months or a year or 2 years and they're not getting anywhere, or they started an agreement with a lawyer or their accountants, or they're working on a structuring a company that then they have to undo because they realize later, oh, that's not actually how we want to do it, or that's not what we're going to do. They've wasted time and money that is fruitless. So if we can solve those issues that are upstream, that they can have their transaction go through much more quickly, more efficiently, with way less pain, they actually are a lot happier, and the business is maximized as well.
Of course, you're well-trained, you're well-experienced, and I understand you've got lots of dealings in organizations like that. Yeah,
there's few things we haven't seen. I mean, we've had siblings, brothers, literally in a fist fight in the boardroom. We've seen a lot of stuff. So the range of normal gets expanded. Mm-hmm. And the reality is that the most proactive, healthy families often, go a long ways through to doing the process well themselves. But even those kinds of families, get stuck at times. I mean, we were working with a family, super capable, competent, first generation, second generation, had some real estate. I mean, we're talking $40, $50 million worth of value. This is significant. Very competent, capable people. Everyone around that table was awesome. But the father and daughter had issues that probably go back decades. And you know what? They weren't unusual issues. And they got to a point where clearly the daughter felt she wasn't trusted. She was still daddy's little girl. That wasn't the case, I don't think, necessarily. But she felt that way. And what the truth of the matter was not irrelevant at that point. It was how she felt the matter. And the father was not going to get anywhere with this competent young woman who was amazing, financially very astute. And we had to kind of help them have a better conversation about this and figure out another way to talk about it so that they could get past it.
So in a situation like that, if you didn't get past that, if that was just something that was left unsaid, would it be possible to get to an end transaction?
Well, they would have ended up in transaction, but it wouldn't have been a different one. They probably would have ended up liquidating the assets, not working together as a family, which is something they wanted to do. So, and they would have liquidated the assets on a suboptimal basis. They would have gotten less value out of the assets because they would have done a quicker sale. It took them longer, but they actually got patient through the process. They got a fantastic return on their investment. They kept engaged with each other and ended up running the business collaboratively, which was actually one of their goals. So would they have gotten a transaction done? Yes. Would it have been the transaction they wanted? Probably not.
So we were chatting earlier, and you had mentioned you've run into situations in the past where some family organization, Generation 1 wants to transfer to Generation 2. Maybe Generation 2 isn't ready yet.
Yeah.
How do you broach that topic? That's got to be an elephant in the room.
It is, yeah. And, we hit it head on. One of the luxuries that we have as someone who's not part of the family and not part of the business is we can speak truth. And they know that there's no edge. We really do care deeply about the family and about the business. And what I'll often say to someone is, if we put your daughter or your son or whoever it is, if they're not ready, we are doing them no favors. We are setting them up for failure. And I know you care about them. So that's not good. And it's sure not going to be good for your business or your team that you've just spent decades building up. So we have to almost help them understand why that is actually the kindest thing that they can do as a parent. It's hard as a parent because the parent's heart is that they want to do this for their kids. But we bring them back to reality and say, treat your family like a family and care about them deeply, and the business like a business, and give the business the TLC that it needs to. And by the way, just because they're not ready today doesn't mean they're not going to be ready. We regularly have development plans for successors that have to be built. But I mean, putting someone in charge of a $20 or $50 million business when they're not ready is like handing a 16-year-old young man who's just gotten his driver's license the keys to a Lamborghini. It will not end well. So why would we do that as parents? We have to help them understand, no, there's a way to prepare them. Let's figure out where the deficits are. And the kids actually often really appreciate it because we put them with a great mentor or put them on, get some training for them. And they're going, oh, this is exactly what we need. Now, they have to be ready for that. And we were working with a family in business here in Edmonton where both of the sons thought they were absolutely ready. Problem is that, they couldn't get along. And we had said, no, what would be really great would be to bring in, because the parents wanted to retire.
Right.
Of course, they want to get out and enjoy some of their life, which they should. But they don't want to be in there holding this fort together. So what we said is, look, let's get another CEO in there for just a transitional period. We're not sure how long it's going to be, but he will mentor these two guys, bring them up to speed. And if they're ready at some point, they can take over. And if they're not, at least the company's protected and you guys can go spend time in the desert or whatever you want to do. And the sons really resisted it at first because they felt like it was the opportunity being taken away. But as they began to see that this was actually the best thing for them to grow as professionals, to actually get mom and dad out of the business, which they wanted to do, they said, okay, we're open to that. And so that helped them a lot.
Right. So you'd mentioned, development plan, trying to bring Generation 2 up to the point where they're ready to go in. And part of that, I guess, could be a transitional CEO coming in. Yeah. Are there any sort of other functional tests or sort of, what else might be on that development plan?
The first thing I ask when I'm meeting with young would-be heirs to the business is I go through just some financial questions with them. And I find out pretty quickly whether they know their way around a balance sheet or a P&L statement or a cash flow, if they understand how receivables work. Like, there is a lot of financial expertise that you need to run a company well. The funny thing is some founders actually don't have all of those themselves, but they have a great accountant, which is fine. But if we're going to test the preparedness of the next generation, I can ask those questions. And that's likely where it'll often show up. They really haven't necessarily even been exposed to some of those things. So how could we expect that they would have it? The good news in that example is that that's a relatively easy thing to train.
So you suggest like an educational program or a couple courses or somebody with a functional background that can come in and teach those.
Even just some mentoring, with someone who's a great accountant or another CEO. Mentoring is actually a great thing. You can set them up in mentor relationships with other CEOs. There are lots of peer advisory groups like YPO or McKay Forum or tech or different kinds. And it depends on the person, what they need. But those things can often be great rocket fuels for their career as well. And if they never end up running the company, it will help prepare them for a better future. So there's no downside. Yeah.
So we've talked about Generation 2 coming up, wanting to take over. Generation 1 knows maybe there's a gap. How do you address key employees? Because there's going to be employees in organizations that aren't family members that potentially think they're on rise to the top. How do you navigate those waters?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say that's a double-edged sword. So yes, there may be key employees that think that they're going to rise to the top. And quite honestly, if that's not going to happen, the kindest thing to do is to help them understand that as soon as possible, especially because they probably have a key role in bringing along those next gen leaders. But the other side of that sword is that there are often people, in fact, I would say in the majority of cases, there are key employees going, I am very worried that there's not a good succession or transition plan. The leader or the CEO says that she's planning to retire, but I see no evidence of that. I know the son or daughter is not ready. I'm really worried about my job. Quite frankly, if they get hit at a railway crossing tomorrow, maybe the person's spouse is now running this company and they haven't got a clue. They've never been inside the door. So allaying concerns about who's going to take over, when they're going to take over, the safety of the jobs of key employees, in fact, their integral role in terms of that transition process is a key piece of the communication that has to happen.
Right. So, and how do you communicate the desire of a founder to transition to key employees or even non-key employees? At some point, rumors are going to start to spread. So what has to take place there?
Yeah, proactively is the quick answer. The sooner you're on that is the better. I mean, it just settles things down because people are thinking those thoughts anyway. Right. They're wondering. And when people start to wonder and not know, they make assumptions. They fill in the blanks with the best understanding that they've got, which is usually wrong. So getting out ahead of those kinds of things, or at least catching up to them, is very, very important. And so what we'll do is, on a very close basis, we'll bring in key employees and with the founder, and we'll help them articulate what's going to happen. Then once the plan is more fleshed out and we've got agreement and everything is fairly firmed up, we make sure there's good communication within the company and so that everybody can feel good about that. And it actually is very helpful for lots of people. It's good for everyone in the company to know where the company is going strategically, leadership-wise. Key suppliers love to know it too. Oh, this is an important client of mine. I can see how they're going to continue to be an important client of mine. If they're key customers, wow, I wonder what's going to happen when Joe dies and he's looking kind of old these days. Have we got a plan here? Because that's an important link to my company. So everyone benefits if we can create clarity around that future.
Right. So, Gregg, what would you say the answer to the question would be? What do they not tell you about business succession?
Yeah. Clients will often sort of obscure three broad areas. One is the things they don't know, things they don't know about themselves or about other people in the family. Remember, I said that if we're talking to individual people and we hear their individual views of what great would look like or fears and concerns, well, not everybody in the family knows those things. And so they can't tell an advisor that. They may not know it themselves. By the end of that round that we do those interviews, we know more about that family's alignment and misalignment than they do themselves because we've heard everybody. But they can't communicate that if they don't know it. The second broad area is things that are very tender or awkward or hard. They don't easily go to talk about stuff like that. It's hard for them. It's been painful. Maybe they have marital strife on top of a succession issue and they're going, well, this is great. I could torpedo my marriage as well as my business. And this is not going well.
Right.
They don't want to talk about that necessarily because it's hard for them. The third thing is that they don't talk about things with certain advisors because they don't really think the advisor is interested. If they go into their lawyer to talk about a unanimous shareholders agreement, or their accountant to talk about restructuring, or their wealth advisor, they don't think that that advisor necessarily is interested in what's going on in the background in their family. That's not something that they think is that is on the table. And so they're not going to talk about it unless there's a window there or someone invites them into that conversation.
Yeah, and of course, that's super important stuff, I imagine. The more you get to know about the organization, the people behind it, the better you're going to be able to help them and come to a solid understanding.
Yeah, it's true. I think in advisors, every client wants someone who kind of gets them, gets their business, knows enough about their family to understand the issues they're working through, especially in these times of succession and transition. And if you find somebody like that, it's just so great because you go, they understand me.
Thanks very much for your time today, Gregg. And thank you for joining us on our very first episode of What They Don't Tell You. In our next episode, we're going to continue the conversation with Gregg. He's going to tell us a little bit more about some of the functional steps that take place in business succession planning.
The very thing that's causing them to be stuck or to not move ahead are the very things that probably will have the greatest value if they can actually get those things resolved. And you are dependent on that person running that company well, your retirement can be at risk. The way to build the value up so that you can maximize that value on sale can take some time. So what do we need to do to make sure that you can maximize that value?